Let's go to the front pages. Now, first up, we've got the Sunday Telegraph. Tories at war over pact with Labour in Scotland. More on that from Douglas Ross a bit later on. Next up, the Sunday Times. Its headline says, Labour's dirty tricks here to stay, says Memo. That's about the adverts on social media we've been seeing about Rishi Sunak. Next one is The Observer. Hospitals in frantic bid to fill gaps left by doctors' strike. And, of course, that's a big strike coming this week, which is worrying many people. Sunday Mirror says, I'll fight gangs and guns for my live. That's from Cheryl Corbell, Olivia Pratt-Corbell's mother. Sunday Express says, King to rescue Rishi. That's not literally, even the polls are pretty bad at the moment. That's about the coronation falling shortly after the local elections, which could be difficult for the Tory party. Mail on Sunday, Charles at odds with Church over his diverse coronation, and more on that with Bishop Alan Smith later on. And finally, the Sun on Sunday, I'm going to smash it on tour. That's about the tragic death of S-Club 7 star Paul Cattermole. Now, with me now to discuss the papers is John Sargent, a former BBC political reporter. John, it's great to have you on. Absolute legend in terms of political reporting circles. What's your first pick from the papers?
Well, I think choosing this storm, they say, it's over, war over the demon eyes.
Yes.
We think of it as a demon eyes question, because if you remember years ago, in the 97 election, they had this amazing ad with Tony Blair with eyes that were flashing, making him look like a demon. Well, that's being compared with this present row about these highly personalised attacks that the Labour Party are putting out, with some of their leading figures, including Lord Blunkett, saying we shouldn't do this. So that's the argument that's going on. The Times story, the Sunday Times story, is simply saying they're going to pursue this, they're going to go on doing this right up until the election. Now, that does not surprise me. I think it's a tactic which we can easily understand, which is going directly for Rishi Sunak. Why? Because he's the #1 asset on the Tory side, but also, and this is maybe a more sort of not such an obvious point, they've got to get across the idea that Labour represents change. And Rishi Sunak mustn't be allowed to say, but I'm change. It's not 13 years of Conservative government, I am the change. Now, in political argument, traditional argument, the biggest slogan in an election, the most important slogan is time for a change. So both parties, both major parties, will be fighting to claim that. We are the party of change. So don't be surprised if this goes right on up to the election.
He's been there 6 months or so, hasn't he? And he's not Boris Johnson. That's his change.
Yeah.
Labour think, well, he's been in power since 2010. Of course, Tories argue only really been in power on their own since 2019, because all that period until then was shared power with other parties, DUP and the Lib Dems. But going back to the memory there of Demonised, that poster. Now, what's interesting, that poster was never actually went out, did it? If you remember. So I think so. Nor is this advert we're seeing this week about Sunak. It's on Twitter, but it's not on any billboards yet. So I wonder whether what you had in the old days was a kind of pre-Twitter storm.
Sure.
About the Demonised.
No, it often happens that way, because what they really want is the publicity. They don't want publicity.
Which they're getting.
Yeah, they don't. Yes, which they're getting in spades, which is, of course, what it's all about, and giving the impression they're cutting through on a major issue. So, to some extent, the details for the campaigners don't matter very much, except they're saying, you know, he's not that great, this Rishi Sunak, and that's all they want to get across.
Because he hasn't been in power for that time. He's only been MP since 2015.
Sure.
You know, he's barely been a minister for any of this time, and he's been blamed for this 12-year Tory record.
But if you imagine what happened when John Major was fighting Neil Kinnock. Neil Kinnock was ahead in the polls. This is 1992. And everyone thought, well, Neil Kinnock's going to win this time. You know, the Tories got into a mess. It's not going to work. John Major won because he represented, wait for it, the change after Margaret Thatcher. He was not Margaret Thatcher. So the potency of this argument is known to everyone at Westminster. They know that this is what matters. So it's not a matter of saying, oh, let's we drop that. There's a bit of opposition. No, they're saying, great. We've got controversy, we've got cut through, we've got all we want from this campaign, as long as not too many of the leading figures on the Conservative side are associated with this.
And the timing's linked to the May elections or next year's general election?
Well, the whole thing doesn't matter. I mean, as long as you keep going and keep attacking Rishi Sunak would be my completely impartial advice to Labour.
So this sort of dirty tricks or these questionable adverts is one area, but what's dominating Westminster really is Scotland at the moment.
It is, yes. And of course the Scottish story is absolutely fascinating. And another thing which you've already mentioned is this question of should there be a pact between the Conservatives and Labour. Now here the situation is quite different.
That's the front page of the Sunday Telegraph.
That's the Sunday Telegraph. But the important point to realise is this, is that if there was a pact between the Tories and Labour to get rid of the SNP, right? Yes. SNP much weakened by recent events. But the key point to bear in mind is that if that was to happen, who would benefit more, the Conservatives or Labour? No, Labour would benefit more. That's why the Conservative High Command in London is saying, don't talk about this.
That's right.
Don't go on about it.
We'll be asking Douglas Ross on that in a few minutes' time. But of course, there's a big story in the Mail Sunday with the unusual side of a motorhome. Now, why is that linked to this SNP story involving Peter Murrell?
This is a tremendous scoop by the Mail on Sunday, I have to say. I mean, this is to get a photograph of £110,000 worth of motorhome being, the police removing it from outside
on a low
loader of Nicola Sturgeon's husband's mother, right? So it's the in-law. Nicola Sturgeon's mother-in-law lives at this property. She's 92, and obviously what they're connecting it with is the whole fraud inquiry. And it does give an amazing twist, because the neighbours are saying that this motorhome was there for 2 years, unused, but at that amount of money, £110,000 for an unused motorhome. And the other rather sort of wonderful sort of side to this, wonderful if you're a journalist like me and you like the twists and turns of the story, but motorhomes apparently are very unpopular in Scotland because the people in the motorhomes don't pay for the hotels.
No.
They take out, they reckon, more from the economy than put back in. So motorhomes are not a good look.
And they've blocked the roads. And those narrow roads are stuck behind them.
Exactly.
I guess I wonder if motorhome might become the symbol of this story in Scotland.
Well, it is. That picture
SNP.
is, you just see it. I hope we can put that picture up again. Excuse me. It is an extraordinary shot, and it's very difficult to deny. As usual, we can't say, oh, it's a fake picture. It couldn't be that motorhome. Oh, no. This must be the motorhome.
Yeah. I wonder if motorhome might become like it was a symbol of this story in Scotland.
Well, I just think once you get into, the motorhome row, but to have it as to have people against motorhomes in Scotland was the twist in the story, which I just couldn't believe that. It was so good.
In the comment pages, there's a very moving piece by Dominic Lawson. It's headlined, "My father would tell me to be objective. I'll try." Of course, his father was Nigel Lawson, who you knew, who died this week. You've seen the piece there. It's a moving piece. What's your memory of Nigel Lawson?
It's a very moving piece, because the closeness between the son and the father is just tremendous. I mean, he used to read all his columns.
Yes.
Nigel Lawson used to read his columns. He was an incredibly clever man. He made mistakes, but in sort of general sort of where does he stand in the Conservative history, it's amazingly high. Him and Geoffrey Howe really running the engine room of Thatcherism.
Dominic Lawson says that he could be breathtakingly blunt about columns he wrote. Did you ever find him being blunt about your reporting when you were working for the BBC?
No, when I had lunch with him when he was Chancellor, and he was extremely polite, not very helpful in terms of giving me comments about what was going on. But there was a moment when I said, now, at some point, careers end, and how would you, if you were resigning, what would it be over an issue, or why might you resign? I was hoping that he would add to this, and he said, no, I'm not going to comment on that. And I said, but would it be fair to say that you'd like to resign on your terms? And of course, in fact, he did resign over an issue, over
in
Margaret
1989, wasn't it?
Yeah, and but I found him, and particularly on this occasion, extremely sort of polite and careful.
Yes.
But the story about him, which to me, it's always stuck in my mind, is Margaret Thatcher telling him to get his hair cut. And you just think, isn't that sort of, it's good and bad. It's both of them together being, half affectionate, half critical, just everything.
Do you think the Tory party has learned the correct lesson from Lawson? I mean, the party often thinks, the right does, talk about the huge cut in the higher rate and the top rate of tax in 1988 from 60% to 40%. And he seems, but of course, he had prepared the ground for that, hadn't he, by controlling inflation in the first part of the decade. That may be forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 points come out of this. First of all, Margaret Thatcher, people imagine, was sort of tempestuous and thinking of things like that. She was actually very careful. Lawson, after all, his great budget is after the election of 87. So you think, oh, why not do it before and catch the votes by saying I'm the tax cutter? So they're very careful. But the key lesson, of course, the Conservative government should realise is you've got to be about something. And Lawson provided so many reasons for being about.
And there's his pictures behind the desk of Jeremy Hunt in number 11 Downing Street as of this morning.
And he wrote a superb book about being in the Treasury, View from number 11. He was highly intellectual, brilliantly clever guy, and very much prepared to talk to people and explain things, as he did to me at that lunch. I wasn't a brilliant pupil, but anyway, he was trying to teach me things.
Now, turning to the Sunday Mirror front page, and this interview here with Cheryl Corbell, who is the mother of Olivia, who was so sadly shot. Now, this interview is fascinating, but it's often what happens in a tragedy like this, that the family become campaigners for some form of change in the law. And she's calling here, isn't she, for a law to force offenders to attend sentencing, because, of course, the killer, Thomas Cashman, didn't do that when he was jailed. No,
it's a very, obviously, all your sympathies are immediately with her. So it doesn't want to sort of say, well, I'm going to talk about this as if it's some politician making these remarks. This is someone who has lived through hell, is living through hell, was at the court. He, of course, was in court for the whole of his trial. Cashman was. So the family are there, they see him, they see all this innocence until proven guilty. And, of course, they know then at the end that there's no question of him not being being totally guilty, and to then find he doesn't come into the dock at the sort of denouement of the whole trial must have been incredibly irritating. You think, right, now you've got to answer. You listen to the judge, this is it. The problem is, if you're then talking about it as a serious proposal, as a proper, not an understandable proposal, but as an actual act that you'd have to put through Parliament, I see enormous difficulties. Are you going to force the person into the dock? Are you going to give them extra sentence? This guy was given a minimum sentence of 42 years. Well, what are you going to do? It will double your sentence if you don't go into the dock. I mean, they can't do that. So it's very difficult to... And then if he's dragged into the dock, they've got to be careful, because it would then give the impression of, mistreating the criminal. You've got all sorts of problems about who's then going to decide whether or not, if he ducks down below the dock, that's a contempt of court or not. And before you know where you are, instead of being the denouement of the trial, it could be just the beginning of another set of extremely unpleasant legal proceedings, because the guy has So the complexity of it, and this is why the television trial is where they show the judge speaking. You can see the advantages of that. They don't go to the criminal because they might start making funny noises or waving or doing all sorts of stupid things. So,
and hearing their voice too.
That's it. So you want to see the judge, which I think has been very interesting. I didn't think it was going to be that good, but what's interesting is how the judges so far we've seen are not toffs. They don't say, "Oh, hello, we're going to go down for 42 yards." They don't say that.
No.
In fact, they're very straightforward people, and I think that's impressive.
John Sargent, thank you for joining us this week to review the papers. Do come back again. Great to have you on.
Thank you.
Thank you.